Mehmet is Vice Chair of Migration Watch, which many of you will be familiar with in terms of its work and often reported in the media and so on. Migration Watch describes itself as an independent think tank which is not opposed to immigration, that is moderate and managed. I'm sure that Alp will kind of perhaps elaborate on that, but believes that at present it is neither. So you get some idea of what Migration Watch's starting point is. Alp, on the left, before becoming Vice Chair of Migration Watch, had a career involving both the Immigration Service and the Diplomatic Service, and his last posting was as Ambassador for Iceland.
To Iceland.
To Iceland, sorry. That's a very important difference, I think. Sunder Katwala is the director of the think tank British Future. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work, and again, it's a very influential think tank, often reported, its views are often sought by the media and so on. British Future is, again, I'll give you a little bit of a taste there, an independent, non-partisan think tank seeking to involve people in an open conversation which addresses people's hopes and fears about identity and integration, migration and opportunity, so that we feel confident about Britain's future. Sunder was formerly director of the Fabian Society, or General Secretary rather of the Fabian Society, and before that was a journalist working for The Observer and also worked for the Foreign Policy Centre. So, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Sunder.
The question today is immigration good for Britain? And I'm going to therefore talk about, there are lots of things we can talk about immigration as an international issue, as a human rights issue, as a domestic issue. I'm going to talk about what Britain can gain from immigration and give you the kind of positive side of the story. But in the context, I think, of a country that's changed quite a lot in recent decades and therefore feels, I think, some unease and anxiety about how we handle that change. And I think from my perspective, the question isn't so much who's right and who's wrong about the sort of benefits and pressures about immigration. It's actually about whether you're the sort of person who sort of embraces change and feels it makes the country more interesting and it's great, or you're the sort of person who feels actually unease and anxiety about change. Whichever of those groups you're in, actually, we're going to have to work together to make the country we live in work. And so that's the ground that I'd like to stake out. What would make people feel more confident about the way we handle immigration in Britain? What would make people perhaps who feel more anxious about it share that confidence that we can handle it well? So I think there are benefits and pressures from immigration, but I think there are things that as a country with a history of immigration and integration, there are ways it's changed our country that we benefit from and that we welcome. And the most popular one, the one that people think of a lot, is food, and that's because food and cultural difference has a long history, actually, and it's a history of things that weren't British becoming British. And that's been true in, recent decades of, curry and pasta and spaghetti and the bagel. It actually goes all the way back to fish and chips, which were a refugee thing that was brought to Britain in terms of putting batter on fish, putting chips with them. So that's a very good example of how things, in a way that came from abroad, become part of who we are. And I think that's the story of immigration and integration. And I think it's a popular story that people welcome, actually, even though it's also something that people worry about. There's Mo Farah, born in Somalia, double gold medal winner for Great Britain at the Olympics. And I think when we see Mo Farah running for Britain, wrapped in Union Jack at the end of his race, we understand why he's proud to be British as a country that gave him protection and opportunity in terms of leaving Somalia, which was a war-torn country at the time, coming here. And I think we're proud of the way that he's embraced that opportunity and contributed enough and become a popular hero. But Mo Farah is an extraordinary story in a way. Not everybody wins 2 Olympic gold medals. So I want to tell you a more ordinary story about immigration to Britain. So there's a picture of my dad and my youngest baby. And I'm not myself an immigrant to Britain, because I was born nearly 40 years ago now in a hospital in Doncaster, 4,000 miles away from where my dad had been born 30 years earlier. So I was born British. Funny thing is, actually, my dad was born a British subject too, because he was born in India in 1944, when it was still part of the British Empire 3 years before Indian independence. But he came to, so he became Indian rather than British because he was third and fourth birthday, and now he's British again. It's come full circle in that respect, because after he'd been to medical college, studied as a doctor, spent a summer on the Indian railways, he came over to work as a doctor in England. And he arrived at Heathrow Airport, it's in 1968, on the Whitsun Bank holiday. It was actually exactly 2 weeks after Enoch Powell, the Conservative politician of the time, made a famous or infamous speech about rivers of blood and about the dangers of immigration to Britain. So I've always thought that speech probably wasn't as well reported in India as Enoch Powell would have hoped, because my dad still got on the plane 2 weeks later. And the theme of that sort of famous speech was the dangers of immigration to Britain. If we had 4 million people who were not white in this country, if we had people who, like me, were born as the children of immigrants, actually what Powell was saying is that those people would be caught without a country, would be neither one thing nor the other, would be, would be sort of British citizens, but would still be sort of somewhere in between, and that wouldn't work, and that we would actually have built our funeral pyre, the language he used, as a country, if that happened. And so that's an example of how the anxiety about immigration has always been there, but that wasn't what we felt, I think, 40 years later, watching Mo Farah win a gold medal for Britain. Actually, we turned out to be better at absorbing that change than many people feared that we might. Enoch Powell did have an ally, though, in my dad's case, in his dad, who came over to try and persuade him to go back home, and said to him, I'll set you up with a surgery back in Baroda. I could arrange a marriage for you. He had a plan that he offered to my dad, and my dad said, no thanks. I'm doing something here now. And he met my mum, who's not from India, but was from Cork in Ireland. She'd never been British actually, but she'd come from. She'd got the ferry from Holyhead she got the ferry from Dublin to Holyhead, got the coach down to Portsmouth, and begun training as a nurse. And so my mum and dad came here, met in the NHS, and that's why I'm here. So I'm a product, I suppose, of immigration as well as of empire and decolonisation and all the rest of it. So I've got some things to be thankful for immigration for, but I've got to persuade other people of that case. Bit of family history. Anyway, so my number one thing, but personal choice. Doctors and nurses for the NHS were a good thing that immigration has brought to this country, like my mum and dad. But I think the reason this is a popular thing that immigration brings to Britain is that we all benefit from having a national health service that's free at the point of use, that's there when you need it. If you've got, like I have, young children, you don't want to, as you might be in another country, say in America, worried about if your children are ill, are there going to be financial pressures, can you afford to see a doctor? It's actually part of the security we've got in our country, because we've made a political choice to have healthcare free at the point of use for everybody. So it's actually possibly the most popular thing we've got in our country, and it's always dependent on immigration. So if it hadn't been for nurses from the West Indies, doctors from all over the world, the NHS wouldn't actually have been able to carry on. And that's been people's, I think, one of people's main, people do or don't have impact with people who've come to Britain from other countries, depending on where they live. If you live in a very diverse area, you'll have a lot of contact. You live in a less diverse area, you'll have a lot less contact. A lot of people have had experience of people who are immigrants to Britain in their life because they've been cared for by an NHS which represents the diversity of the British population today. And I think that is something we benefit from. Immigration can bring people who create jobs in this country, which is a good thing. Cobra beer is a decent beer to have with a curry, if you go for a curry. And it started off by a guy called Karen Billamori in a flat somewhere in Fulham, West London, lugging around the odd box of beer here and there to the odd local restaurant. And he's created a business, a brand, from having that idea that, a bit of a less fizzy beer drink with your curry go down well. And that now exports to 50 countries. And the fact that we export Cobra beer to India is, I think, a good benefit of immigration to Britain. And that's part of the story, actually, being an island nation, I think. that if you're an island, actually, sometimes you actually feel, well, it's good to be an island in this part of our culture that, you know, you've got some protection from the rest of the world. But actually, an island needs connections with the rest of the world. And if there's one thing you can say about Britain in its history, and you can say it's been a good thing or a bad thing, because the truth is it's been both, it's always been an island that's had connections with the rest of the world. And who we are now reflects the history of Britain's global engagement and the consequences of that for British society. So whatever you think of that history, and it's a history of empire and of decolonisation, you can't deny that it's caused us to be the people we are now. Students. The biggest group of immigrants to Britain, and not a lot of people know this because it's not what they're thinking of, as studies have shown about immigrants, but of the 550,000 or so people a year who come to Britain, about a third of them, or 200,000 of them or so, are students. And they come to study in Britain. And I think one of the reasons our universities have world-class reputations for research and science and literature and culture is that they're part of a global network of learning. And they need international academics, international students, and that's part of the experience of being a student in Britain today. I doubt you can go to a university in Britain today and not then encounter people who've come to study at the same university from another country and who come to study here. So that, I think, can enrich your experience of being a student, especially if you're going to study international affairs, international politics and immigration. You're actually going to get different perspectives on it. You're going to learn from that. The Vice-Chancellor will think, well, there's a lot of money in that too. And that'll be another thing that universities benefit from. And there's no doubt at all, obviously, that the facilities our universities have for their students are made possible through funding from lots of different sources, but one of those sources are the fees that international students pay because they wanted to come from Britain. My view is we should increase the number of students who study in Britain in a world from other countries, because I think it's good for education and I think it's good for the economy, and because there's going to be a growing demand for education around the world from the growing economies like Brazil, like China, like India. And I would like British universities, there's no limit at the moment on the number of students who can come in as such, but there is a pressure to say, well, it shouldn't get too high because we're worried about immigration numbers. I would like to see British universities as one of the top choices for people who want to get a global education. I hope that they will choose to come to Britain. Obviously, lots of people go to the United States, lots of people go to Australia, lots of people study in India and China and everywhere else. But I think we should be in favour of more of this kind of education, because I think it's good for the universities. It's also good for the towns and cities that universities are in. It keeps the economy going, it keeps the restaurants going, it keeps the cab drivers and cab fares and all the rest of it. So I think people who don't go to university, I think, benefit from this cultural and economic benefit. I think that experience of studying alongside other students at university is increasingly true of our primary schools and our secondary schools, actually. That Britain under 16, Britain under 11, and Britain under 5 is actually a considerably more diverse place than adult Britain these days. And I think people can worry about that, and legitimately so, because if you're thinking about how your 5-year-old is going to get on in school, you will actually be concerned if, for example, quite a lot of children in the class who don't have English as a first language, the first term might be being used to get everybody up to speed in English so that they can all learn together and do well. So you'll be worried about that pressure. And I think it's really important, therefore, if we're going to keep people's confidence in immigration, that we show that we're actually investing in those children being where they need to be to learn with all the other children, you know, as quickly as possible, and that everyone knows that that's been properly resourced. I think that will give people confidence as long as they know that's happening. But when that does happen, I think that's a good education to have in terms of the world that today's 5-year-olds are going to live in and go out and try and get a job in 10, 15 years down the line. Actually, I think having that cultural diversity increasingly there in Britain, if we've handled the sort of pressures of it well, is actually going to be good for people having the confidence to go out into the world, and I think that can help equip them to succeed as long as we deal with people. And actually, a really good example of this, which I don't think is that well known, because I think people can intuitively see why that will be difficult. We can say it's good for diversity if there are 200 languages in a city like London, or 50 languages or something in a city like Leeds. It's obviously quite difficult for teachers if you don't give everybody a common language. I think that's important. Actually, the area that's experienced that most in the last 10 or 15 years is London. And so London has had to deal with the pressure of large-scale immigration, especially at a young age, and the increasing diversity. And while that's been going on, and people might have worried about how the schools are doing it, London schools have actually gone from the bottom of the league table, regionally and nationally, to the top of the league table, and actually have had a fantastic turnaround in their educational results. So that means actually that schools have got to grips with doing this, but it actually probably means that something beneficial came into the school with that sense of immigrant optimism, immigrant aspiration. If people have travelled to a new country to make a new life for themselves and their children, then there's a real sense of a willingness to contribute. And I don't think you can understand the improved results in London and the way that's fed through the school system without seeing that there's a beneficial pressure on schools to raise their game, as well as a pressure to handle with growing diversity. Britain has a proud history, I think, of protecting genuine refugees and people who needed protection, and it goes back a long way, because Europe was a continent of religious tension, of religious turmoil, and so the Huguenots, who were being persecuted for their religion, came to Britain as refugees and were protected. And this has always been a contentious issue. It was a contentious issue when there were large flows of Jewish refugees in the 1890s. It was a contentious issue when there were large flows of Jewish refugees from Hitler's Germany in the 1930s, and people said, but they're clearly under pressure. But if we take them and treat them well, maybe too many will come, and we won't cope. And that's what the newspapers said. But actually, it's been right to do the right thing to protect people who need protection in our country, and we should do it because it's the right thing. We've also done well by doing the right thing. Here in Leeds, Marks and Spencer wasn't a global conglomerate. It was an idea for a stall on the railway station by Michael Marks, a refugee to this country, who decided to sell things cheap in a way that attracted people, and he turned it into what became Marks and Spencer's. That's a contribution from refugees to create a sort of famous British business, a famous British brand. The Paralympic Games, which we celebrated alongside the Olympic Games, were the idea of Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, a refugee from Hitler's Germany, looking at people who've got injuries at Stoke Mandeville Hospital and saying, we could do something here, and that became the Paralympics. And I think, we were proud. I was very proud that this country took the Paralympics very, very seriously as part of our sort of hosting of the Olympics. And these debates go on because asylum and refugee numbers, they go up and they go down. They're quite low at the moment, actually. Not a lot of people know that. So about 20,000 people a year apply for asylum in Britain. So we ought to be able to make the right decisions, make fair decisions, and do it kind of quickly. Unfortunately, we don't have a system that works very well, and we had much higher numbers 10 or 12 years ago. It was about 100,000 people a year, and the system, lost people's files for not just for months on end, but for years on end, didn't give them a decision, massive backlog of unopened. People with their lives in limbo have come here saying they have a fear of persecution. They're expecting a country like Britain to judge their case fairly on its merits and give people protection. And if people then are going to be part of our society, want to support them to integrate into our society, we've dropped the ball, actually, and that's been, I think, a terrible thing for people who believe in refugee protection. It's been a terrible thing for people who think that you want a system that works. And then you have debates like this petition here was about people who were translators for British soldiers in Afghanistan and were then threatened by the Taliban because they'd done that. And they were sent letters, actually, by our government and our authorities saying, well, why don't you move to an area where the Taliban won't find you then? Because we don't know if we're... And in the end, there was campaigning pressure to let those people come to Britain because we owed them a debt of honour, and I think that had widespread support, and the government changed its mind and let some of them in. So I think those debates about protection remain very important, but I think that's part of our history as a country to accept the claims of people who do need that. Immigration isn't all about glamorous stories. A lot of immigration is about unskilled and lower skilled immigration. It's about people who come to do tough jobs that need doing. Somebody does have to pick strawberries unless you want to import all of the strawberries. And I think you can have a debate, which I think will no doubt contribute to, about when and why more people here should want to do some of the tough jobs as well. But there are no doubt some jobs, especially in agriculture and so on, that need that need labour and often need migrant labour because it's tough work at the minimum wage often. I think the key thing, if we're going to have this kind of immigration, which is part of modern economy, I suppose, is that you do enforce the rules of labour protection for migrants as well as for citizens, so that you can't get jobs done by exploiting migrants in a way that you wouldn't be able to exploit citizens. So I think it's good to have a minimum wage. It's important to check that people are being paid the minimum wage and to enforce companies to pay the minimum wage, because otherwise you'll have the exploitation of the most vulnerable, often new migrants to this country, and the fear of being undercut by people who aren't paid well. So I think it's important to handle low-skilled migration in terms of fair labour standards for everybody, rather than in terms of setting migrants and citizens against each other. But on the whole, migrants are more likely to be in work and less likely to be on benefits. You have quite a big debate about welfare tourism. There's a new study out which shows what most other studies have shown, which is that there are gains from immigration as well as pressures from immigration. It comes out, mostly quite even for migrants from outside the European Union. For migrants inside the European Economic Area, there's a net contribution. Why is there a net contribution? Some people say, it's because Polish people work hard and, rich people are too lazy, and I think that's a bit of a caricature of the way that people are. I think, broadly speaking, people are people. The reason this happens, I think, is that 97-98% of people in Poland stayed in Poland in 2004, when the chance to work anywhere in the European Union, well, in Britain first and then later anywhere in the European Union, opened up. And 2 or 3% of Poles left their country and went to Britain or went to Germany, and so on. And so it's inevitably the case that if a small group of people cross borders and cross a continent, they're likely to be more highly educated and have more sort of ethos and get up and go than the people who don't. So I think there are plenty of lazy Polish plumbers back in Poland, but the people who came to London tended to be there. So I think it's not a mystery as to why they do it. And the other reason that migrants are a net contributor to public purses, often they arrive after the costs. If you think about your own life and when does the state pay money to you and when do you pay money back to the state? Well, while you're in full-time education, the state's spending a lot of money on you. Migrants arrive after that. You then pay taxes when you get a job, and you contribute, you're a contributor, and as you grow old, actually the state starts to look after you again in terms of pensions and old age care. Migrants obviously often arrive later in that process and don't meet the earlier costs, and quite a lot in an area like EU free movement go home again as well, and so on. So there's a sort of rational explanation as to why there's net contribution. It's not because some people are better people than other people. It's just because of the way that people's life systems work. So I think there are benefits from immigration. I hope that I've managed to say what some of them are. I think there are real problems with immigration too. Al will tell you a lot about them, so I won't spend very much time on them. People don't think the immigration system works well. They don't think that the government has got a grip on who's coming in and the decisions that are made about different categories of immigration. The reason people think it doesn't work well is because it doesn't work well. It's actually a bit of a dysfunctional mess. I think if you're in favour of immigration, you should be in favour of a system that works well and that we invest in properly, that can cope with about 100 million people are crossing borders in and out as tourists, as businessmen, as travellers, not as immigrants every year. And you really need a system that can deal with those pressures for being part of the modern world. We don't have that system, we should do it. I think it's a good part of democracy actually to say that immigration is an issue for the community to decide about. And I think it is actually, if we want to have immigration to Britain, I think we've got to win a public argument for it. But I don't think that is just about what is the number of immigrants. I think it should be about what is the right level of student immigration, what is the right level of skilled immigration, what is the right level of unskilled immigration, what is the right approach to family migration, what is the right approach to refugee protection. Because, cutting numbers is a legitimate debate in terms of how many people of this particular economic visa do we want to have. But I'd be very worried about cutting the numbers of students or cutting numbers of people who've got a valid claim to persecution under the Asylum Convention. So I'm interested in what we do in the different categories. And I think it's very important to make people feel that as a society changes fast and becomes more diverse, that we do still share things in common. So I actually think that we should talk about immigration, of course, and the choices we make, but we should also talk about integration more. And I think that all of the benefits of immigration that I've talked about historically and today, there are benefits to migrants of immigration, and there are benefits to Britain as well when we have immigration with integration. So when you have immigration with integration, that people are working in the National Health Service not sort of being exploited somewhere in the black economy. It's when you have immigration and integration that it creates jobs here for British people as well as for migrant workers. It's when you have immigration and integration that Mo Farah is running around a stadium in a British vest, being cheered on with Union Jacks. And that, I think, symbolically can give us confidence that we can make it work. We have a history in this country of immigration and integration. Think of things that are the most British things that we've got, like the monarchy. And think about how much immigration there is in that story. It's true of the monarchy, it's true of the NHS, it's true of the army, it's true of our society. I think we should, in a diverse society, come together, celebrate things together, and do things together, and celebrate the diversity that we've got, but take seriously people's concerns about how we're handling it, and show that we can handle it well as a modern country that wants to be connected to and part of the modern world. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lots of things that Sunder said that will no doubt pick up in our discussion. What I'd like to do, first of all, is say there's a huge amount that we agree on. I have no problem with immigration. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm a first generation immigrant. Wonderful thing. I spent most of my working life overseas encouraging students to come here, giving scholarships to students to come here. I've spent my time becoming a part of this society that we are all mostly a part of now. That's what I'd like to see. Migration Watch, of course, we're in favour of immigration. What's the question? Is immigration good for Britain? Well, of course immigration has been good for Britain. Any civilised, progressive, dynamic society is going to have an element of immigration. Who on earth is going to disagree with that? But just because immigration is a good thing most of the time, it doesn't mean that more of it is better. And what I'd like to start with is to run through the position as it is with regards to population at the moment. First of all, I'm going to explain how this is totally unprecedented. Sunder mentioned Huguenots, the Jews, all sorts of people who've come to this country in our history. Yes, they have. But the present scale of migration to this country is totally unprecedented. It has never happened before. And what I would like to see, not to stop immigration, but to see much less immigration in all our interests, including those who arrive here and either want to settle or spend some time here. 63 million, the government forecasts project to 70 million by 2027. If migration continues at the present rate, nearly 68% of that will be, the population increase will be the result of immigration. This is what would happen, how quickly we would get to 72, 73 million with 200,000 net a year, and the rest, this is what would happen with 40,000 net a year, and those in between. At the moment, we're sort of about here. I would like to see that come down. That still means a hell of a lot of immigration, by the way. We're still talking about 350,000 people arriving in this country to stay, either to settle permanently or certainly to stay for 3, 4, 5 years. I said that this was entirely a new scale. This is what was happening to net migration going back to the 90s, where this is where it was, around 50,000, just below, just over. In fact, it was negative at various times. Then It started growing from 2001, particularly 98, 99. Sunder might say, well, I know why you've chosen that date. 1997 was when the Labour administration came in. That did have something to do with it. In fact, we know that a lot of the immigration was actually intentional, and for whatever reason, it was considered to be a good thing economically. It bore down on wages, it bore down on inflation, and clearly that was both among the objectives, economic objectives of the government. By 2011, this is where we were. 2010, there was a net migration of 252,000. That is not at any time in our history anything that we've experienced. Of course, it had to come down. This happens to be public concern. People are asked, polling on what they think about immigration, how they feel about immigration, and generally this, if you think back to the last graph, it correlates. The higher the migration, the more the concern appeared to be. 1 year maybe would be a one-off. This is over a period. Excuse me. Problems of old age. My nose is running. These are the reasons why people came here. Students, work, family. Family, other, all sorts of reasons. Tended to be fairly low, study and work. Now students, of course students are very welcome. Genuine students, the more the merrier, I say. There is no problem with genuine students coming here, all of you, those of you who are overseas, following your courses, getting your degrees, even being able to work here for a couple of years. And no one stopped that yet. You can get a job. Perhaps I won't be thanked for advertising that in certain quarters. But if you get a graduate level job, then you can continue to work here. Incidentally, I hate to be the bearer of bad news as well, but something like 20% of our graduates are unemployed or not doing jobs for which they've been trained. That's another story. Asylum, as Sunder said, this is not an issue. We have never at Migration Watch suggested that we should stop providing refuge to people who need it, those who are escaping persecution. Of course we've got all that protection. The problem is that there have been so many cases of abuse that I think it behoves us to look more closely and more carefully at those who are seeking asylum. Are they genuine asylum seekers, or are they simply looking for a better economic circumstance? And why not? My family did it. Most people forget about, for example, housing when it comes to immigration. Over the next 20 years, we're going to have something like 36% of new households being formed to be the result of immigration. Houses, schools. We need school places. It's all very well to say, yes, everyone welcome, come here, you're young, you're working, you're paying your taxes. Yes, all that is true. But no one ever gives a thought to the kids a few years down the road who are going to need school places. We are going to need more teachers. We are going to need a great deal more in order to educate those youngsters and right through their school and university careers. We work closely with a group in Parliament called the Balanced Migration Group, jointly chaired by, believe it or not, a Labour and a Conservative politician. They advocate a zero net migration where the number of people coming in equates to the number of people leaving. We haven't actually gone that far. In fact, at the moment, we're happy with reaching tens of thousands. I'd like to see it come down. I think it will. What balanced migration isn't, it doesn't require us to leave the European Union, simply because if you look at the immigration that's been taking place over the last 15, 20 years, 2/3 of it has been from outside the EU. That is changing, particularly over the coming few years, and it has changed more recently as well. Of course, it doesn't mean that we're going to have to stop taking genuine asylum seekers, and it also doesn't stop companies from bringing key staff in, from bringing the skills that they may require. There were visas, 20,700 visas allowed for bringing in skills that we can't access for whatever reason in this country. Only half of those visas have ever been taken up. As we see it, the benefits of balanced migration, the need for a competitive economy with costs of a rapidly growing population are clear. If the quicker we grow, the more we need to spend, the more resources we need in order to ensure that we all have a reasonable standard of living. That really brings me on to what I feel particularly strongly about, and what Sunder is also keen on, and that's integration. If you have a group of youngsters arriving in a school, 2 or 3, as happened when I went to school in the 1950s, I was the only child in that school that didn't have English as a first language, that didn't speak English, indeed. Took me a while to learn English. The same school now has something like 95 to 98% of children whose language, second language at best, is English, very often the third language, but certainly not their mother tongue, or indeed who arrive suddenly and don't speak any English at all. It becomes so much more difficult to ensure that those youngsters become a part of our society, become a part of the society that I believe Sunder and I are a part of now. What I don't want is what some people advocate, and that's effectively separation. What we did in our efforts to be kind and caring and not to offend, we actually encouraged people to retain their identity and the way of life that they brought with them from whichever country they came, rather than helping them to, certainly no one is suggesting that we're all assimilated, so that we're all becoming some sort of Little England or whatever. But what we want is for everyone to feel that they are a part of our society. And frankly, it's all very well to say, yes, but think of the Olympic medals that we're going to miss out on. If we're going to have an immigration policy that's based on whether or not we're likely to get an Olympic medal, a gold medal out of it, I don't think that that is something that most people in this country would actually wear. What I'd like to go on to now is ask you a couple of questions, if I may. Here we are, all in the same room. Most of us, I think, would regard ourselves as some form of British, or English, or Scottish, or Welsh. Can I ask how many people regard themselves as English? Scots? Welsh? Yeah, Dad. My wife is Welsh. Yes. What about from other countries? Afro-Caribbean countries? Where are you from?
I was born and here, grew up in Turks and Caicos Islands, so British nationality.
Yeah. What else? Sir? Where are you from?
Originally from Nigeria.
From Nigeria. Spent 4 very happy years in Lagos.
Nice.
And is that where you're from?
Yeah.
This was in the early 80s. There was a period when uncontrolled immigration led to something like 1 million Ghanaians working illegally in the country. And the then President Shehu Shagari, he gathered them all up and said, you're here illegally, and shipped them all off back to Ghana. That's not going to happen here, I hasten to add, but it's interesting that whichever country you come from, actually, there is a desire to control migration, to control immigration in the interests of everyone. There's lots else to discuss. Let's leave it to the Q&A. I'd just like to finish with, yes, immigration is a good thing. Yes, immigration has contributed a lot. That doesn't mean to say it should not be controlled. And over the last 15 years or so, it has all but been out of control, and that's what I would like to change. So, yes, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to ask, what's your opinions on religious schools? Because from my experience, they don't really tend to help integration and diversity. I was wondering what your opinions are.
So religious schools, did you say?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then
Might have a bigger question, possibly more out, but it's I couldn't see what the downside of immigration was from your presentation. If there's pressure on housing, pressure on education, pressure on the NHS, but people are working and paying tax, that's a different government problem. It's not an immigration problem. It's a failure to fund public services with taxation. So I'm not quite sure where your problem was. And also the big hump in immigration in the 90s, in the early part of this century, were coinciding with a big growth in the economy, high levels of employment. So again, I'm not seeing the downside. I'm not sure you kind of made the point of what the downside is.
okay, thank you. And then yeah, please.
You both talked about integration, how important it is, and I agree with that. But how do you think that you can go about actually doing it? Because I see, where I live in Bradford, and I see a lot of tension in certain areas of Bradford. There's not a lot of integration, but I would like to do something to try and make it more integrated, make people get along more as a community, but I don't know how to go about doing that anyway.
Okay, do you want to respond to those and then we'll...
Do you want this first answer?
Religious schools, so you can go first.
Yeah. Faith schools, I can see why people would worry about them, and why, in many ways, it isn't the best way, perhaps, to have integrated education in towns and cities. And if you think about, the most segregated sort of cities in the UK, you go and look at Belfast, where you get a kind of segregation of two communities and so on, and that is not a good vision of society. But I would take a slightly more sort of pragmatic view. Actually, we are going to have faith schools in our education system, I think, because of the length of time that they've been here and because of the level of support they have within the communities that have them. In the case of, say, Church of England, Roman Catholic and Jewish schools, I think it's actually inconceivable to me that a democratic government would actually be able to say, actually, we've decided it's a terrible mistake and we're going to do it just politically. And so I would aim for the possible thing we could do, which is actually, if we're going to have faith-based education, I'd like it in the state system more than outside the state system. And I'd like to set some rules about might be about intakes, but also about the level of contact you want between schools, what you teach in the curriculum, what you have to teach about other faiths, and so on. And so I do it that way because I think if, say you've got a long history of Church of England, Roman Catholic and Jewish schools, I think it is going to be a matter of basic fairness that if there are new faiths with sufficient numbers, and so people say, well, we now like to have Hindu schools on exactly the same terms, we like Muslim schools on exactly the same terms. I can't see how you can make a distinction there, and I don't think you can go around. So I would put more pressure on schools to have more contact between schools of different faith backgrounds and to make sure that they're teaching a multi-faith curriculum, even if it's a faith school. And then I just think actually a faith ethos for education can be a good thing if it's on that basis. And that is linked, I think, to the question about integration. How do you actually do it? I think it's a really good question. The answer is that first, it's a free society and it's a liberal society, so you've got to be careful about how much sort of top-downness you try and do, and it can go wrong. But actually, the answer, what brings about integration is contact. And contact is a good thing, and when you make contact possible, it kind of works. And when you get that kind of hardening of separation in a place like Belfast, and it might happen in a place like Bradford as well, it becomes much harder for people who'd like there to be more integration, who would like the schools to be more mixed, but they become quite diverse even if you want to be mixed. It's very hard if you're the only Asian parent to send your kids to a school that is 99% white, or the only white parent. So you've got to sort of think about the levers. But actually, if you bring people together, then things work. So I think we should be looking in a sort of liberal society where people make their own choices to make sure there are opportunities for contact. We should use things like popular occasions. I would make more in England of St George's Day, and then say we're going to mark this in Bradford, and we're going to mark it in an inclusive way, so it's very clear that everybody's invited. And people would be surprised if it worked. But my sense is actually it would work. And I spent some time in Bradford actually after the football team, which is in the 4th division of football, got to the Wembley Cup final. We were talking about things that could bring the town together, and that sort of the claret and amber colours, which in a way are a tribal colour of Bradford pride. There was a real appetite for them to be shared by the whole town, not to belong to one part of the town. But it's very hard, for the reasons you say, for people to do it themselves if you don't create the space where it happens. And when you do create a space where it happens, you get a lot of integration and a lot of mixing. I mean, the positive thing about Bradford is that about 12% of households in Bradford have people of different ethnicities in the same household because they're married or because they're kids. And so there's a natural sort of integration that happens if people meet, but it's not an integration that happens if people never have contact, and then you get stereotyping of groups and quite a hardening of attitudes. So I think you've got to be quite subtle about it, but it's worth putting some attention into sort of creating the possibility that it does happen.
Faith schools, I think all schools should be preparing our young people for the society that they're going to be living, working in as adults. The problem with some faith schools is that they are really more mindful of preparing youngsters for a community, for a society that they've left behind. If they are, faith is one thing, and we all have our faith, I hope, or we're not believers. There are those who believe that existence, living, is all about their faith. Fine, that's for them. Others who are at best agnostic, possibly atheists, do not believe. Fine. There are schools where, frankly, this wasn't just Muslim, Islam schools. This probably happened in some of the Catholic schools as well, in days gone by, where it was a sin, it was wicked not to believe. There was a hostility and there was a pressure that you had to believe or else. I think, and don't ask me to provide any evidence, but I'm pretty sure that there are schools now in this country where that sort of brand of, I think, backward thinking about what faith is all about still exists. And that I believe is wrong and should be rooted out. I would, as I say, I want whatever faith children have and whatever faith they're taught in, I would like them to go out into the world and mix with other faiths and other people who believe just as strongly but have a different religion. Should we answer some of the other questions as well?
Yes, take all three. Yeah.
Downside to immigration. We've said immigration is a good thing, but as I said, more of it is not necessarily better. Are you saying to me that immigration has been good, therefore, let me finish, therefore anyone who wants to come here as an immigrant, fine?
No,
that's a recipe for disaster.
No, what I'm saying is that where's the evidence that it's been a problem, and what's the evidence going to be a problem in the future? You've got loads of graphs.
Well,
I used to work for the government, I can do graphs that have come years,
sure,
saying all sorts of things, but I mean, basically, if there's pressures on schools and the NHS and people are working, like I said, that's a government problem. It's not investing enough money. If people are paying tax, then that tax.
I'm sorry, my friend. It's not a government problem. It's all our problem, including those who are going to those schools. Sunder referred to if you've got your child going to a school where actually teaching them is going to be a bit of an obstacle because of the language barrier. But apart from that, my grandchildren go to a school which is a lovely school, mixed community. All of a sudden, that school is having to take an additional class each year. They're going to have to build on their land for additional classrooms. That is not government's problem. That is a problem for everyone.
Can I make a point? Can I make a point outside? Let me make a point outside of the debate here. Let me give you 3 reasons why I think there's something to worry about. And I think, you know, if you're in the group of people who think cultural diversity is good and it enriches my life and I like it being more different, you know, it's easy to say, well, I don't understand why you're worried, and I think you misunderstood the issue. I think three reasons to worry about it and then think about what we do about it. Firstly, there'll be benefits and there'll be pressures, and you're right that if people earn and pay into the system should be able to afford it. But the people who gain and the people who feel under pressure might not be the same people, might not be the same areas. And that's definitely true in class terms. The gains go to everybody, and if you're quite well off and quite secure, you've been to university, then you get the cultural gains. But if you're in low-paid work, then you're more likely to worry about is there a competition at the bottom. And then the other thing to worry about is when there isn't the preparation to move the resources to where the pressure is. And I think that was true in this decade where things moved more quickly. European Union migration, you get a census every 10 years. You count people, you might not count people accurately in an area that's fast moving like East London, and so you might not give the local authorities in that area the right amount of money. They might get the right amount of money for 20,000 people less than they've got a few years later, and then you haven't put in place. So by failing to prepare and plan for change, you will then create what you don't want, which is that, you know, the people at the sharp end will get scapegoated for it, and that's why I think you've got to show that you're managing it. And the lack of public confidence is therefore a problem, because we made enormous progress on race relations in this country in my lifetime, but we have this very anxious debate about racism, much of it quite reasonable, about opportunities and about issues of integration, some of it really toxic at the hard end, and we need to isolate the toxic bit and reject it. And the way to do that is to say to people, well, this is what we can do about the pressure you're feeling about jobs. We could manage that. I mean, I might then be not cutting the immigration numbers. I might be saying we need better enforcement of minimum wage. But sometimes we might be saying, actually, this form of exploitation is going on because we haven't checked. You know, I don't know, people are bringing in, people are using this visa and sort of abusing the way they use domestic workers, say, in, you know, embassies or something like that. We should cut out exploitation. So there are things to worry about, and we could, I think, if we're on the pro-immigration side, we should deal with those reasonable pressures so that we can isolate the kind of, you know, aggressive, rejectionist bit of the debate, really.
Can I just one point to that? Fine, we have said that immigration has been a good thing, and I stick by that. However, it is very much based in the present and the immediate past. Very few people have considered the future when it came to immigration, and these numbers that I alluded to earlier, the experts might see them as being a bit simple. Most of us actually understand a straightforward graph a bit better. The fact is that very few people, when it came to immigration, ever considered what the consequences would be and the pressures on our resources in the future. That's what I would like to see more of, and it's really, dare I say it, that Sunder's side of the house has actually started to do exactly that, so that the Labour Party now, the Liberal Democrats even, are actually saying things that we were saying 10 years ago and we were taken to task over. Well, I welcome the conversion.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to answer the question about integration, or was there anything just to remind you of those?
Yeah, that's really, the integration was almost tied up with the faith schools bit. I think that a lot of schools are certainly, they've got a great deal to play, a role and a great deal to play for in the way that they do their jobs. What I would frankly not do, and I don't welcome, and I didn't when I was an immigration officer 30 years ago, importing religious leaders of one form or another to head communities, to head our schools, to bring in whoever it may be from the other part of Asia or from Latin America or whatever, to teach in our schools beyond faith and teaching really a way of life, saying, you know, this is where you come from, don't ever forget it, and this is the way we want you to behave. The way that women and girls are treated in some areas, some schools, some communities, I find quite abhorrent, and I come from a Muslim family.
When we talk about the conceptions that people have about immigration and the conception that it is a negative thing, and you talked about that conception, I think you cannot get away from the simple fact that's because politicians for 50 years have been saying that, and the press have been saying it's a negative thing. And there's not been a convergence over the last 10 years. The convergence happened after Smethwick in '64, when the Labour Party capitulated over the question of immigration to the Tories. That's when the convergence began in '60, and it's been our lifetime for that convergence of that sort of an argument. Now, example on that. The day before Thatcher made the famous swamp speech, 9% of people in Britain thought that immigration was a problem. The day after she made the swamp speech in '78, 21% said that it's a problem. Politicians play a role, do not simply reflect. Now, you are saying that Sunder's right about the jobs and the wages and etc., etc. We all know that's a fact. You have to teach this stuff on a regular basis. The problem is the perception out there is that immigrants steal our jobs, push wages down. And actually the reality is completely the opposite way around. And what we need are more voices saying that if you want to integrate, the way you do that is to say you are welcome here because it's better for all of us that you are here. I think the thing on population numbers is completely spurious, anti-scientific nonsense. There's no other way of talking about it, and I will give you an example on that. In 1801, the first British census of 1801, the population was, hands up in the crowd, 7 3/4 million of Britain. That was at the time that Malthus was peddling the idea that if we add more and more people, we would run out of food very, very quickly. The idea then that we could have a population of 63 million and have the conditions of life that we now have with 63 million would have seen cloud cuckoo land nonsense. And it is because of a conception simply of new people as new mouths to feed rather than new hands to work as well. And the figures about the NHS, 30% of doctors, 40% of nurses coming from immigrant communities, you know, saying that they are a cost is only looking at one side of the equation, and we need to be looking at the other side. In terms of perception, sorry, I could go on all day. In terms of perception, the fundamental issue is this. We have a race riot in Britain in the late 50s at Notting Hill. We attacked, there's a race riot, and the response of politicians is to say that the blacks being beaten up by neo-Nazi gangs are the problem. The response in the community was to create the Notting Hill Festival. And the response in the community has created this wonderful multicultural scene in London over the last 50 years where people fought from Notting Hill, through the struggles in the 70s with the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism, through the struggles of Unite Against Fascism and People Against the EDL and such like at the moment, there's been a constant struggle, and that constant struggle has conflicted with common sense perceptions. I think it's fundamentally important that we look at the positives, and it is disingenuous, I think is the polite word, to say that it's been all right in the past, but 63 to 70 million. Well, 7.75 million to 63 million, and we've still got these wonderful conditions that we've got today, because those extra 60 million people were all hands to work as well as mouths to feed and created the great world that we live in.
Okay, thanks. So no question. No actual question there, but I'm sure that Sunder and Alp will respond to what you said. So at the back in the orange.
Yeah, it's scary to follow that, but I'm just going to put a simple question now across actually, and I'm glad that you agree that integration is a positive thing. But you know, if I ask you a question, lately we've had leaders, politicians, you know, like Angela Merkel and Cameron, both agreeing or actually saying that integration is a failed experiment, as they put it. You know, your take on that, because these people have, after those speeches, we saw what happened in Germany, where there was a lot of breakouts of fascist movements, and then came Tony Gordon Brown with his speech of British jobs for British people, which the intention behind which I understand, but the way it's put, I think, is not put in a balanced way. Then it causes racial tension in communities that are trying to work through these things.
Okay.
Yeah, my question is, why are you trying to argue for the benefits of immigration? Who are you trying to convince? And what do you hope to achieve from that? And I guess it sort of follows on from that point, because are you saying that there's a problem of ordinary people being opposed to immigration, and that in and of itself is a problem? Because you're not arguing that we should scrap immigration controls, which, you know, so surely you accept then the arguments of the gentleman on the right that there are problems, and you disagree with this gentleman that people aren't a problem. Because you're essentially saying that people are a problem if you support immigration control. So I'm just wondering why you're arguing for the benefits of immigration to support immigration controls.
Okay, yeah. Paul kind of covered it, but the fact that the NHS gains like so much from immigration, like countries like South Africa, that like nurses come from, under a system where like immigration would be kind of heavily imposed, or like there'd be harder barriers, would like surely the NHS would lose out, or if it didn't, would it be like just kind of a hard track for any, so you can come to this country as long as you work for the NHS? Is that like the other option that you're talking about?
I think there was one more, somebody else indicated, so I don't want to kind of exclude them, but was it?
I think it was me. My question is, according to your own opinions, do you think that the next coming general election is going to be one based, you know, on the immigration issue?
Do I say that again?
The next coming general election, is it going to be one based on the election issue?
Will this be a big issue in the next
Can the
time?
election issue be used as a strategic point to to win the elections?
Okay, you okay to? So we'll start with Alp this time then.
Well, thank you for the any questions, intervention, eliciting the round of applause. No, two things really. First of all, no one is suggesting stopping immigration, for goodness sake. If you're saying to me that we can deal no problem with any number coming here, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. We can't and we shouldn't. Secondly, on a democracy problem, if you're saying that people are so stupid that they believe everything politicians tell them, therefore politicians are the ones to blame in saying to them that immigration is a bad thing, therefore everyone thinks immigration is a bad thing. No, people make up their own minds, frankly, and most people in this country don't want to stop immigration, they want to see less of it. It's democracy, pure and simple. I think it's also common sense to have less immigration, but continue with immigration. the last point of the NHS, again, no one, and this has really been the problem over the last, I don't know, however many years I've been engaged in this, where the moment you say control immigration, the moment you point to what is potentially a downside to immigration, everyone says you're anti-immigration, you're anti-immigrant. No. What we're saying is that in any orderly society where we're all trying to live in harmony, then it behoves us to look at the rate of immigration as well, which has been way too high. There was the point about multiculturalism. It wasn't integration, it was multiculturalism. And it wasn't just Merkel and Cameron cozying up and saying this was a bad thing or it had failed. No less a person than Trevor Phillips thought that it was something that had failed, and not only had it failed, but it had encouraged separation rather than bringing people together. There was another point, politics and immigration. I think immigration, yes, will play a significant part in the next election. How people decide to vote will depend on whether or not, A, they believe that the Tories, because the Lib Dems have been reluctant, whether they believe the Tories have actually had a reasonable stab and done the right thing or not. Whether they believe that the Labour Party back in office is actually going to, as it's saying it's going to go back on a lot of the stuff that it was doing during its last term in office. Most certainly, politicians themselves will find that each time they knock on the door and say, are you going to vote for me or please vote for me, many people are going to say to them, what is your position on immigration? So for all those reasons, yes, it will play a significant part. How people decide to vote, I have no idea. I'm not a politician.
Just to say something about where perceptions are at the moment. It's the number 2 issue of people's general concern at the moment in terms of issues facing the country after the economy. If you ask them about issues facing their local area, it drops down quite a lot because actually people feel it's being handled not too badly where they live, but they feel at a national level we're not handling it well, and that could be a point about national politicians and the media. But there's also because border control, who comes in, they are national issues, how our cohesiveness of the society. So it's clearly around and it's important. Why not open borders was one of the questions, and I think this is simply a question of democratic consent if you live in a liberal democracy as we do. People are quite concerned about the current levels. It's perfectly appropriate and legitimate if it's what you'd like to see, to argue for open borders. I think it would be dangerous to do it without support for doing it. At the moment, about a fifth or quarter of people are quite content with the types of levels we've seen, not worried about Alps levels, and about 3% of people would like to see higher immigration than we've got because they take that, very liberal or quite utopian kind of view. And about 2/3 of people think it should come down, and then there are lots of differences between those 2/3 of people. A quarter of people will actually say we'd shut the borders, and I think it's hard to reason with people like that, but they're a minority. And then the people who say we'd reduce it a bit then have very different views. They wouldn't reduce the number of students, they wouldn't reduce the number of care workers, they wouldn't reduce the number of skilled people. They're very worried about the number of asylum seekers, which they take to be much higher than it is. And people are very worried about illegal immigration, which they have a particular view about. So people have a moderate set of views, but I think if you want to argue for anybody who wants to come to this country should be allowed to come to this country, I think for reasons of good community relations, I think you've got to have some political support and some public consent to do it. Takes me over to this question. Millions of things one could say about it. The points that were made, of course politicians have responsibility, of course the media have responsibility, and of course some people uphold that responsibility and some people don't. The main point I would put back in a way, a challenge to that point, is in arguing that argument, in arguing that case, in wanting to shift the argument, you won't change anybody's minds with facts. It's not because facts don't matter. Facts are very important, I think, when policy is being made in a department of government. They should be very important in, you know, debates at an elite level, in policy, in parliament. But people don't change their minds about facts. Think of an issue on which you have a strong view. Some of you will think George Osborne is a brilliant chancellor who is doing brilliant work with our economy, and some of you will think the opposite.
Should we have a show of hands?
Say that. And now, if I said a new study has been published, and it says, although you think he's doing brilliantly, he's doing terribly, you know, you think he's doing terribly, actually, his economic policy is brilliant, a new study has just been published by the Study of Economic Studies Institute, you will say to me, if you don't agree with it, well, who are they? And what are their agenda, and who's funded them, and what have they done? And if you agree already with the position, because it's a study saying austerity is terrible and we'll do something different, you'll be tweeting it out. So your friends, a study or a fact is good ammunition for the side you're already on, and it doesn't actually change people's minds. And if you look at work on political psychology, like the political brain, facts are quite low down the things that change. So in a way, turning the facts into stories. Now, you might think some stories are told about this and they don't have good facts about them. Having good stories that get the facts across. So, you know, net contribution numbers, people who don't believe statistics won't believe that, and they think the government's lost control of immigration. Hearing about someone who came over and created jobs, and here are the 3 people who got jobs because of it, that will have a powerful impact, and that might change people's names. So I'm reluctant to sort of go down the kind of tell people they're wrong and myth bust, because actually it's good for morale of people doing the myth busting, but it doesn't actually reach the people who are somewhere in the middle. I think we need to reach them. Final word on the European situation. The first thing says people had very different models. In Germany, Merkel said multiculturalism failed. Integration didn't work well in Germany for a long time. It's because people who were born in Germany from Turkish parents, whose parents were born in Germany, of Turkish grandparents, they weren't allowed to be German for a very long time. There was no offer of integration to those people, and then they decided to change that, and they will get more integration from doing it. If multiculturalism has failed in France, it's very surprising, because nobody ever heard that they were in favour of it for a long time. And so there's a sense in which you're having these debates, but people mean very different things by different words. Multiculturalism is not my favourite approach to address these issues. I think it means different things to different people, and it's a different debate. But where I think there are real limits on it is, I think, as a debate within ethnic minority communities in Britain about handling diversity and about making a British identity that people from minorities could be part of, it worked quite well. But that was a debate about national identity, not about ethnic minorities. And for people who are part of the majority community, they thought it was a debate of the minorities, for the minorities, about the minorities. That wasn't their debate. Well, 8% of the population can't have a debate about the national identity and what it's going to be if the white majority population isn't part of that debate. So I think multiculturalism had inherent limits. I think also it changes over 3 and 4 generations. Racial categories break down because the number of mixed race people doubled from one census to the next, and race means something very different actually to my children and their generation than it did, and I think that's a good thing. But the models have been very different. The reason I think we have too much anxiety about it, it's important we work more on it, is that segregation and problems are very visible, and integration, when it works, is quite invisible, because people integrate. If 2 nutcases go out and burn a poppy loudly, they will be on the news that night and for years. And actually, you know, the study by Oxford University Press on ethnic minority attitudes things, about 62% of people from minority background express support for poppies and say they'd wear one, including about half of British Muslims. That's 1 million British Muslims who say they support remembrance and wear a poppy. They don't get invited onto the radio and the television, whereas 2 nutcases do. So I think we've all got a responsibility, I think, to tell the story about the everyday non-problematic nature of integration, as well as for policy to focus on the problems of segregation and division where they exist.
Can I just add a point to that on Germany and the Turks? My name is very clearly Turkish. I worked in Germany for 4 years. What it taught me there, so it's absolutely right, that the Germans, it wasn't until I think something like 1999 or 2000 that the Germans actually changed their citizenship nationality laws to give potentially, anyway, not in every case, German citizenship to 3rd, 4th generation Germans who nevertheless, as far as German law was concerned, remained not German but Turkish. What it taught me was that it was a two-way street. Integration was a two-way street. And you will find with a lot of Turks, because of the nature of being Turkish, the way that they were brought up and how they had Turkishness inculcated into them, what you found was that it wasn't just the Germans who didn't want the Turks to become German, but the Turks most certainly did not want to give up their Turkishness and become German. And that is where
But the offer wasn't made. That's your two-way street.
No.
There was no offer on
Well,
the table, was there?
even more recently, it still remains the case. Of the 3 million Turks, they still regard themselves, whatever they hold, they still regard themselves as Turks. Believe me, Turks, that's my family, and that's how they see themselves. The fact is that if we want people to be British, who are born and grow up here, then we ought to give thought of the sort of things that Sunder's been talking about and I've been talking about and others have mentioned as to how we ensure that our society is more cohesive and is more together than, I think, certainly multiculturalism as it became, the concept of multiculturalism, elevated to a creed almost, that actually pushed people apart rather than brought them together.
Right, we're going to have to stop there. I know that there are probably lots more questions, and I know Paul would want to come back if I would let him, but I won't. So we do have to finish here because there will be another class trying to get in. We're obviously going to have another session on the German guest worker system.
We're always celebrating Birmingham the Catholic.
But could I thank you all for coming? Thanks for your questions, but obviously particularly thank Alton and Mehmet for making